Major Charles Carpenter flew low over Lorraine with 6 M1 bazookas mounted beneath his L-4 Grasshopper's wings, a modification that pushed the fragile aircraft to its absolute weight limit. Below, he spotted German Panther tanks crawling across the farmland, their sloped armor cutting through patches of morning fog. He could have stayed a history teacher in Illinois, holding chalk instead of a control stick. But now his fellow soldiers were dying, and observation alone wasn't enough. He pushed the nose down, diving toward 50 tons of German steel that could shred his spotter plane with a single burst. And it all started from here. The September sky over Lorraine hung low and gray, pressing down on the rolling farmland like a woolen blanket. Major Charles M. Carpenter banked his L-4 Grasshopper into a gentle turn, the 4-cylinder Continental engine chugging steadily at his back. Below, the French countryside spread out in a patchwork of fields and villages, deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Only the black scars of artillery craters and the skeletal remains of a burned-out farmhouse betrayed the war that had swept through these valleys. Carpenter adjusted his grip on the control stick, feeling the familiar vibration travel up through his palm. At 32, he had the lean, weathered look of a man who'd spent too many hours squinting into the sun. Before the war, he'd been a history teacher in Moline, Illinois, drilling high school students on the causes of the Franco-Prussian War and coaching the football team. Now he was making history himself, though in ways he'd never imagined standing in front of a blackboard. He'd arrived in France in July, assigned to the 1st Armored Division as an artillery spotter. The work was necessary, vital even. From his perch in the Grasshopper, he could see enemy positions that ground forces couldn't, directing fire with precision that saved American lives. But it felt passive, removed. He'd watch through binoculars as shells landed where he'd called them, see German tanks burning in the distance, and feel like a spectator in his own war. The Grasshopper was a marvel of simplicity. Less than 1,000 pounds of welded steel frame and fabric skin, powered by an engine that produced barely 65 horsepower. It could land on a cow pasture and take off from a country road. But it was unarmed, defenseless, except for the pilot's ability to stay low and fast when things got hot. Other L-4 pilots had started bolting bazookas to their wings. Carpenter had watched them take off with the M1 rocket launchers strapped beneath the fabric, and something had clicked in his mind. His Grasshopper, serial number 43-30426, nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer after the women working the factory lines back home, now carried 6 bazookas, 3 under each wing. The weight pushed the little plane to its limits, but Carpenter had done the math. It would fly, and it would fight. Third Army was pushing toward the German border, but logistics were strangling the advance. Fuel shipments had been diverted north to support Market Garden in Holland, leaving Patton's tankers rationing gasoline and scrounging ammunition. The 4th Armored Division had punched across the Moselle and seized a bridgehead at WWII, but everyone knew the Germans would counterattack. Intelligence reported panzer units massing near Arracourt. Carpenter throttled back, dropping to 500 feet. In the distance, he could see American Sherman tanks dug into defensive positions along a ridgeline. Beyond them, the morning mist still clung to the lowlands where German armor would come. His fingers found the electrical switches mounted near the throttle, 6 of them, 1 for each bazooka. He hadn't fired them in combat yet. Soon, he suspected, that would change. The briefing tent smelled of canvas and cigarette smoke. Colonel Bruce Clark stood before a map of the Arracourt sector, his pointer tapping the thin red line marking American positions. Behind him, officers from Combat Command A crowded onto folding chairs, their faces showing the fatigue of 2 months' constant advance. 5th Panzer Army, Clark said, circling a cluster of enemy symbols east of the town. Von Manteuffel's got the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades moving up. Probably the 11th Panzer Division behind them. Expect Panthers, expect Panzer IVs, and expect them to hit hard. Carpenter sat in the back, his garrison cap folded in his hands. The other pilots from the artillery spotting section flanked him, Lieutenant Williams, fresh-faced and still learning to read terrain from altitude, and Captain Morrison, who'd been flying Cubs since North Africa. Morrison had been the first to mount bazookas on his Grasshopper. He'd shown Carpenter how to wire the electrical firing system, how to compensate for the added weight on takeoff. Air support will be limited, Clark continued. Weather's supposed to deteriorate. Fog in the valleys, low ceiling. We'll be relying on what we have on the ground and whatever you Cubs can give us. After the briefing, Carpenter walked the flight line with Morrison. Their Grasshoppers sat in a row, staked down against the wind. Ground crews worked in the drizzle, checking control cables and topping off fuel tanks. Rosie, the rocketer, looked almost comical with the bazookas jutting from beneath her wings, a child's toy pretending to be a weapon of war. "You really going to use those things?" Morrison asked, nodding at the rocket launchers. "That's the idea." "Awful close to the ground, Charlie. Those Panthers have machine guns on top." Carpenter ran his hand along the fabric fuselage. The Grasshopper was fragile, he knew that. A single burst of machine gun fire would shred her like paper. But the bazookas could punch through 4 inches of armor. He'd done the calculations, studied the intelligence reports on German tank deployments. An M6A3 rocket hitting a Panther's thinner side or rear armor could knock it out completely. "My idea of fighting a war," he said, echoing the words he'd told a reporter the week before, "is attack, attack, and then attack again." Morrison shook his head but smiled. "Just don't get yourself killed proving a point." That evening, Carpenter wrote a letter to Elda. He kept it brief, cheerful, mentioning nothing about bazookas or Panthers or the weight sitting in his chest. He told her about the French countryside, about a farmer who'd given him fresh eggs that morning. He asked about their daughter Carol, hoped she was doing well in school. He signed it with love and sealed the envelope, knowing it might be weeks before she received it. The rain picked up after dark, drumming against the tent roof. Carpenter lay on his cot listening to the rhythm, thinking about what morning would bring. His Grasshopper sat outside in the wet darkness, loaded and ready. 6 bazookas. 6 chances to make a difference. He closed his eyes, but sleep came slowly. Dawn broke cold and gray over Arracourt on September 20th. Carpenter was airborne by first light, the Grasshopper's engine rasping in the damp air as he climbed through patchy fog. Visibility was poor, maybe half a mile in places where the mist pooled in the valleys. He kept low, skimming the tree line at 300 feet, watching the eastern approaches. The radio crackled. "All units, this is command. Enemy armor spotted moving west from Coincourt. Multiple contacts, heavy tanks." Carpenter banked north, squinting through the plexiglass greenhouse canopy. The fog was lifting now, burned off by the weak morning sun, and that's when he saw them. Dark shapes emerging from the tree line like prehistoric beasts. Panthers. 4 of them in a loose wedge formation, their long 75mm guns traversing as they advanced across open farmland toward American positions. His pulse kicked up. The Grasshopper felt suddenly very small, very fragile. The Continental engine coughed once, then steadied. Carpenter's hand moved to the electrical switches mounted beside the throttle, 6 of them, numbered 1 through 6. His mouth had gone dry. The lead Panther was perhaps 800 yards from the nearest American Shermans. Too close. Carpenter pushed the stick forward, dropping to 200 feet. The slipstream howled past the open window. Below, he could see German tank commanders standing in their hatches, probably scanning for threats from ground level. None of them looked up. He came in from the south, using the rising sun to mask his approach. The Grasshopper's shadow flickered across the ground. At 200 yards, he could see individual details: the Zimmerit anti-mine paste coating the Panther's hull, the spare track links bolted to its glacis plate, the commander's black leather jacket. The tank's side armor angled toward him, maybe 40 millimeters thick where the sponson met the hull. Carpenter flipped the first switch. The bazooka fired with a sharp crack, the rocket motor igniting beneath the wing. White smoke streamed behind the M6A3 projectile as it arced downward. Carpenter pulled back on the stick, climbing sharply. He never saw the impact, just felt the grasshopper shudder as concussion from below buffeted the airframe. When he looked back, the Panther had stopped. Black smoke poured from its engine deck. The commander was scrambling out of the hatch, his jacket on fire. "Jesus," Carpenter breathed. The other 3 Panthers scattered, breaking formation. Machine gun tracers reached up toward him, the bright green phosphorescent rounds the German gunners favored, arcing past his wingtip like malevolent fireflies. Carpenter jinked right, then left, the grasshopper responding with the nimbleness that made cubs so hard to hit. The fabric skin rippled in the wind. 85 miles per hour felt like nothing when bullets were coming at you. He circled wide, gaining altitude to 500 feet. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system. Below, the burning Panther had become a funeral pyre, ammunition cooking off inside with sharp popping sounds. American Shermans were advancing from their positions, taking advantage of the confusion. The second Panther was moving fast, trying to flank the American line. Carpenter lined up for another pass. This time, the Germans were ready. The Panther's hull-mounted machine gun opened up before he was in range, forcing him to veer off. He came around again, lower this time, barely 50 feet off the deck. The farmland blurred beneath him. He could smell cordite and aviation fuel, taste copper in his mouth. At 100 yards, he fired switches 2 and 3 in quick succession. Both rockets launched, their backblast scorching the fabric beneath his wings. One missed wide, plowing into the earth in a geyser of dirt. The other caught the Panther's rear deck, the thinner armor above the engine compartment. The tank lurched, slewed sideways, and stopped. No fire this time, but it wasn't moving. Carpenter pulled up hard, the grasshopper climbing at full throttle. His altimeter read 800 feet when he leveled off. Below, the battlefield had transformed into chaos. More German tanks were emerging from the east, but American artillery was finding its range now, shells bursting among the advancing Panthers in dirty brown flowers. The radio screamed with conflicting orders, urgent calls for fire support, damage reports. He had 4 bazookas left. His fuel gauge showed half empty. Morrison's voice came through the radio reporting 2 more kills near the village. The grasshoppers were working. Carpenter turned south, looking for targets, his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted out. By midday, the battle had spread across 5 miles of Lorraine farmland. Carpenter had been in the air for nearly 4 hours, landing twice to refuel and rearm. His back ached from the constant maneuvering, and his eyes burned from squinting into the haze of smoke that now covered the battlefield like a shroud. The Germans kept coming. Every time American forces knocked out a Panther or Panzer IV, 2 more seemed to appear from the tree lines to the east. Von Manteuffel was throwing everything he had at 4th Armored, trying to break through to Nancy and cut off Patton's supply lines. Intelligence had been wrong about the numbers. This wasn't a probe or a spoiling attack. This was a full-scale counteroffensive. Carpenter spotted a column of 3 Panthers moving through a sunken road north of Arracourt. He pushed the throttle forward, descending to make another attack run. That's when the weather turned against him. The fog that had burned off at dawn was coming back, rolling in from the valleys in thick gray banks. Visibility dropped to a quarter mile, then less. The ground disappeared beneath him in patches, reappearing in brief windows like something glimpsed through dirty glass. He lined up on the lead Panther anyway, dropping to 100 feet. Too low. He knew it was too low, but in the fog he had no choice. If he went higher, he'd lose sight of the target completely. The grasshopper shuddered in the turbulent air. His 4th bazooka fired, the rocket streaking downward, but the Panther's commander had seen him this time. The hull machine gun opened up, a string of tracers rising to meet him like a ladder of green light. Carpenter felt the impacts before he heard them, a series of sharp bangs as bullets punched through the fabric skin behind his seat. The grasshopper lurched. Wind screamed through new holes in the fuselage. His instrument panel shattered, glass fragments peppering his flight suit. The altimeter spun wildly, the needle broken. He pulled back hard on the stick, climbing blindly into the fog. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught again. Oil pressure looked good. The controls still responded, but he could feel the Grasshopper flying differently now, heavier on one side, the airframe damaged in ways he couldn't see. "Command, this is Carpenter," he said into the radio, forcing his voice steady. "I'm hit. Returning to base." Static answered him. He tried again. Nothing. The radio was dead, shot out, or disconnected. He was alone in the fog with a crippled aircraft and no way to call for help. Carpenter checked his compass, turned west toward friendly lines. The fog pressed in on all sides, reducing the world to a gray void. He flew by instinct and dead reckoning, watching his fuel gauge creep toward empty. Below, he caught glimpses of terrain through breaks in the cloud, a road, a burned-out barn, a crater-pocked field. Nothing he recognized. The engine coughed again. This time it didn't catch smoothly. Black smoke trailed from beneath the cowling. Carpenter's stomach tightened. The Continental could run rough for hours if it had to, but not with battle damage. Not with oil leaking and cylinders misfiring. He descended slowly, searching for somewhere to land. The fog broke over a pasture, and he saw it, a relatively flat stretch of grass between two hedgerows, maybe 300 yards long. It would have to do. He had no other choice. The approach was terrible. Without instruments, he had to judge altitude by eye, guessing at his descent rate. The Grasshopper mushed through the air, sluggish with damage and the weight of 2 remaining bazookas. Carpenter slipped left to lose altitude, then right, bleeding off speed. The hedgerow rushed up at him. Too fast. He was coming in too fast. The wheels hit hard. The Grasshopper bounced, came down again, the landing gear screaming. Carpenter stood on the brakes. The tail came up, threatening to nose over. He felt the propeller tips strike the ground, heard the sharp crack of wood splintering. Then the Grasshopper slewed sideways and stopped, one wing dragging in the mud. Silence. The engine ticked as it cooled. Carpenter sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the control stick, and realized he was shaking. Through the bullet holes in the fuselage behind him, he could see daylight. 6 inches to the right, and those rounds would have gone through his seat. Through him. He climbed out on unsteady legs. Rosie the rocketer sat canted in the mud, her propeller shattered, fabric skin torn and flapping in the breeze. Oil dripped from the engine cowling. The right landing gear strut had buckled. She wouldn't fly again without major repairs. In the distance, artillery rumbled. The battle was still going on, and Carpenter was stuck on the ground, miles from friendly lines, with fog closing in and German armor somewhere in the murk. Carpenter stood beside his crippled Grasshopper and listened. Artillery thunder rolled across the countryside, but it was moving east, American guns pounding German positions. The sound of tank engines had faded. He pulled out his compass, oriented himself west, and started walking. The fog made everything uncertain. Shapes loomed and disappeared, trees, fence posts, the hulking silhouette of what might have been a barn or a destroyed tank. He kept one hand on his service pistol, a .45 that felt wholly inadequate for the situation. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cool air. After 20 minutes, he found a road. The mud showed fresh tank tracks heading east, the distinctive pattern of Panther road wheels pressed deep into the soil. German, then. He was behind their lines, or at least in contested territory. Carpenter crouched in the ditch and waited, listening. Voices carried through the fog, American voices. He raised his head cautiously and saw them. A squad of infantry moving along the hedgerow, rifles at the ready, their olive-drab uniforms dark with rain. A sergeant led them, an M1 Garand across his chest. "Don't shoot!" Carpenter called out, standing slowly with his hands visible. "Friendly! I'm a pilot!" The sergeant swung his rifle toward him, then lowered it when he saw the flight suit and major's insignia. "Christ, sir. What are you doing out here?" "My Grasshopper's in that field back there. Took fire and had to put her down." The sergeant whistled low. "You're lucky. Germans pulled back about an hour ago. We're mopping up stragglers." He gestured toward the west. "Command post's about 2 miles that way. We can get you there." They moved through the fog in single file, the infantrymen keeping watch while Carpenter walked in the center of the column. His legs felt unsteady, adrenaline crash mixing with exhaustion. One of the soldiers offered him a canteen and he drank gratefully, the water cold and metallic. As they walked, the fog began to lift again, revealing the aftermath of battle. A Panzer IV sat burned out in a field, its turret blown completely off and lying 20 yards away. 2 American Shermans had been knocked out near a crossroads, their crews already evacuated or dead. Shell craters pocked the landscape. A dead horse lay in a ditch, its harness still attached to an overturned farm cart. The command post was a commandeered farmhouse with sandbags piled around the windows. Colonel Clark was there, studying maps with his staff. He looked up when Carpenter entered, surprise crossing his face. "Carpenter, heard you went down. You hurt?" "No, sir. Aircraft's damaged, but I'm fine." Clark nodded. "Good, because I need to know what you saw up there before you crashed. Intelligence is trying to figure out if this is their main push or if they're holding reserves." Carpenter described what he'd seen, the columns of Panthers, the concentration of armor near Arracourt, the way the Germans had committed their forces without holding anything back. Clark listened, making notes, occasionally asking questions. "Your tactics worked," Clark said finally. "The Cubs, with bazookas, disrupted their formations, gave our Shermans time to get into position. Morrison got 3 more before he ran out of rockets. Williams scared off a whole platoon just by making strafing runs." He paused. "How many did you get before you went down?" 2 confirmed, sir. Maybe a 3rd damaged." "Not bad for a history teacher." Clark almost smiled. "We held them. Lost some tanks, lost some men, but we held. The Germans are pulling back to regroup." Outside, the sound of artillery had stopped. The fog was lifting completely now, revealing a sky the color of slate. Somewhere in the distance, Carpenter could hear American voices calling to each other, the clank of tank treads, the familiar sounds of an army that had survived another day. He thought about Rosie the rocketer sitting broken in that field, her propeller shattered and her fabric skin torn. She'd gotten him through, done exactly what he'd asked of her and then some. The ground crew could repair her, get her flying again. Or maybe not. Maybe she'd given everything she had. Carpenter felt the weight of exhaustion settle over him like a blanket. His hands had stopped shaking, but they ached from gripping the control stick for so long. He'd attacked, and attacked again, just like he'd said. And somehow, improbably, he'd survived. The battle for Arracourt continued for another week, but Carpenter watched most of it from the ground. Rosie the rocketer was towed back to the airfield on a flatbed truck, her broken propeller and torn fabric a testament to how close things had been. The ground crew worked miracles. Within 5 days they had her patched and flying again, though she bore scars that no amount of dope and fabric could fully hide. By the time the fighting ended, 4th Armored Division had destroyed or damaged over 200 German tanks, while losing only 25 Shermans. The Grasshoppers, with their improvised bazooka armament, had accounted for a surprising number of kills. Morrison claimed 5, Williams 3, and Carpenter's official tally stood at 4 confirmed. The innovation that had seemed almost reckless proved devastatingly effective against an enemy that never thought to look up for threats. Carpenter flew again on September 28th, a routine artillery spotting mission over quiet countryside. The bazookas were still mounted under his wings, but he never fired them. The Germans had learned their lesson, keeping their armor under cover when Cubs were overhead. The psychological effect alone was worth something. He rode to Elda that night, sitting in his tent with a kerosene lamp casting shadows on the canvas walls. He told her the fighting had been hard, but that he was safe. He mentioned nothing about being shot down, nothing about the bullet holes that had come within inches of killing him. What would be the point of worrying her? Instead, he wrote about the French countryside, about hoping the war would end soon, about wanting to hold their daughter Carol again. The letters from home took weeks to arrive, but when they did, they carried him back to another world, one of school bells and football practice, of quiet evenings grading papers at the kitchen table while Carol played with her toys on the floor. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated not just by an ocean, but by everything he'd seen and done. He wondered sometimes if he could ever truly return to it. Morrison found him one evening after mess carrying 2 cups of coffee. They sat on empty ammunition crates and watched the sun set over the French hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "They're talking about giving you a medal," Morrison said. Carpenter shrugged. "For what? Strapping rockets to a cub and hoping for the best? For doing something nobody else had the guts to try. For making a difference." Morrison sipped his coffee. "You know what the infantry's calling you? Bazooka Charlie." The nickname would stick, though Carpenter never much cared for it. He wasn't trying to be a legend or prove anything beyond what his conscience demanded. He'd seen a problem, enemy armor threatening American lives, and found a solution. That was all. The fact that it worked still surprised him sometimes. The war pushed eastward. Carpenter and Rosie the Rocketer followed, flying reconnaissance over the Siegfried Line, then into Germany itself. He accumulated more missions, more hours in the air, but never again faced the intensity of those September days at Arracourt. When victory finally came in May of 1945, Carpenter was ready to go home, ready to trade the cramped cockpit of a Grasshopper for the familiar classroom in Moline, ready to teach history instead of making it, ready to hold his wife and daughter and try to remember who he'd been before the war taught him what he was capable of. Rosie the Rocketer would have a different fate, sold as surplus, repainted, her true history forgotten for decades until researchers found her gathering dust in an Austrian museum. But on those last flights over France, with the bazookas still mounted under her wings and the battle scars hidden beneath fresh fabric, she carried a history teacher who'd learned that sometimes attacking was the only choice that mattered.